Welcome to the From Concealment Podcast, the show for firearm enthusiasts who like to shoot, train, carry, and compete. Get ready for some shooting and sight, firearm and accessory reviews, and of course, insight on concealed carry. And now, broadcasting from behind enemy lines in the From Concealment studio, it's Pete Mitchell and Dan Sams.
Welcome to the From Concealment Podcast. I'm Pete Mitchell.
And I'm Dan Sams.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Second Amendment and how it was originally intended. And of course, before we get to that, this episode is being brought to you by Fast OC. If you're looking at getting involved in any handgun challenges, or if you would like to go through any of their great training courses that they've got shotgun courses, they've got advanced CCW courses, which is what I like to refer to as the From Concealment courses, and you are in Southern California, head on over to fastoc.com, check them out, sign up for a course. You'll probably see me at a handgun challenge, and I like to go to courses. I like to train, so if I can, I go to those too.
Nice.
So Dan, tell us about some of your research. I love the fact that you're the smart one here, and I just get to sit back and bask in your research.
See, I don't know about that. I do what I can. I research when I'm interested in something. But I've been in some discussions in the last couple of years, but especially lately related to the language of the Second Amendment. And it's always interesting to me. People will cite things from the Supreme Court, and one of the things I will often point out is that the Supreme Court is made up of 9 people, and they regularly are split down the middle. Right. So on these issues, it is regular that there are different interpretations, even at the highest level. So you can't always just say, well, this is just how it is. What is particularly interesting to me is that the Second Amendment is one thing that there tends to be pretty clear agreement on. Now, the Supreme Court will regularly rule for infringement on things. They've done it multiple times, and they'll usually use language of like, well, but the safety outweighs the infringement. I think we might have mentioned on here one time about the police roadblocks and how because it's an illegal seizure. And their language is, we allow for it because of the safety outweighing it, but they admit to the infringement in it, which is always intriguing to me. So just kind of setting that table, because a lot of times people will say, but the Supreme Court says this or that. And I'm like, yeah, but they disagree with each other. And sometimes they even admit that it's an infringement, but they have some other agenda going on. I hope that doesn't get me in trouble somehow.
But that is actually the reason why they write dissenting arguments, right?
Exactly right.
You have the one that prevailed, and they usually pick one justice to write that argument, and then usually one justice writes the argument, hey, this is why we're against it, because they will change over time. Like they will have new members on the Supreme Court, and another case will be brought to them, and they might reverse it. I mean, we saw that with the death penalty. They said it was unconstitutional, and then it got reversed again, and now it's constitutional again. So, yeah. So
this is why I'd love to start off, if you're up for it. I just want to read the language of the Second Amendment. I think so many times people will cite things as constitutional or not constitutional without going to the original text. And so I'm just going to read it. This is Amendment 2 of the Constitution. It's part of the Bill of Rights, which seems to have a special nod, right? Those 10 Bill of Rights seem to have a special level of gravitas, even over other amendments. But Amendment 2, it says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to secure a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And so a lot of people note that the language of this kind of flows a little funny. And so you will usually, like you and I, we would point immediately to the end of this phrase saying the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And most of us rightly can say, there's not a lot of room for debate on here, that any infringement on the right of free people to keep and bear arms is a violation. And so regardless of what anybody says, that statement stands on its own. However, we've had a lot of debate recently about the meaning of the word militia. Have you gotten into this at all in debates with people, Pete, the whole discussion about militia?
I haven't got into it only because, I just kind of point out to people, I go, well, yeah, but understand we didn't have a national military
exactly
back then.
Yeah. So one of the things I'll ask is like, okay, so what do you think a militia is? And what do you think well-regulated mean? And by the way, I always point out that that doesn't change the fact at the end of this phrasing is still no infringement, right? There's not supposed to be any infringement whatsoever. But this language of a well-regulated militia, and I point out like what was happening in this time. Well, it was a militia of non-conscripted volunteers who call it defended the country, who revolted against our leaders for the sake of freedom. And so militias were just farm boys and their guns. And so a lot of times when people hear a well-regulated militia, often people are thinking, okay, well, keeping a militia in check, right? When the language, as we're reading some of the founding fathers, seems to be a well-regulated militia as in as much militia as we can get. Because the whole point here is we're not supposed to have a standing army, right? At least in the plan of the founding fathers, the idea was let's not have a standing army because then we get into all kinds of wars we don't need to be into. Why don't we just make sure that the people are equipped and can defend themselves and can be called upon to defend when needed, but keep it volunteer, keep it separate, keep it not a standing army. And so it's just really, so any thoughts on that, by the way, because I'm going to get really excited if I'm not careful and I'll just go crazy.
So you don't think
they
wanted to have a standing army at all on any level?
Well, I'm not sure they wanted to. From the looks of some of the language, the idea was that these were free militias that could be called upon to fulfill the duties of an army, but that they weren't necessarily standing. Like the idea of, the citizen soldier, that these are guys who can be called upon to do stuff, but their jobs are not army. It just seems to be that's what they're going at. But not everybody agrees, I admit, but it seems like this language continually comes back to militia rather than standing army. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, because again, keep in mind that back in that time, it was very much a United States, meaning they saw themselves as a Virginian first, or, I'm from Georgia. It wasn't, I'm an American by any means. I mean, that wasn't how they saw themselves. So it wouldn't surprise me if they, were totally against the idea of a national army and probably more in favor of a state army, what we'd now call a National Guard.
Yeah. And I would argue that is probably the best understanding of a militia. The idea of a state National Guard, right? That you have guys that are still connected. There's still an organizing of them, but they are dudes who are farming, and when called, or whatever their occupation is, and when called upon, they're reporting to their state's militia, and certainly can be gathered together to defend the country as a whole. But they're just, it's interesting. We read the Constitution, read the rest of it. There's not a mention of a national fighting force other than the militias that are called up. Just an interesting thing to consider. And some of the reason that seems to be cited is like, well, we don't want to get, if we've got an army, we're going to use it. And unfortunately that seems to happen when, it's like, I've got a hammer in my hand all the time. What am I going to hit?
Right.
And, so obviously not discrediting. We've got plenty of people in the armed forces. We think very highly of them. They've stepped into an interesting and important role. I would argue we would be better off if we structured it differently, but that's not discounting that we got some awesome dudes who have a great heart to defend the country. Praise God for that. So I just think it's worth noting, though, some of these quotes that come up in relation to this whole concept of militia. This language here of Samuel Adams' quote says, "The Constitution shall never be constructed to prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms." There's all this language of Thomas Paine. He says, "Arms like laws discourage and keep the invader and the plunderer in awe, and preserve order in the world as well as property. The same balance would be preserved were all the world destitute of arms, for all would be alike. But since some will not, others dare not lay them aside. Horrid mischief would ensue, one half of the world deprived the use of them." And just ongoing language here about militias. George Mason had this quote. It says, "I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people except a few public officers." I thought that was really interesting. Anyway, that's just been on my mind as I'm sitting down with lawyers at times in just informal discussion, who are like, "Oh, well, this is what the Second Amendment means." And I'm like, okay, let's look at the language. Now let's parse it out. And I'm finding myself in conversations where even lawyers, so they went to school for this, it might not have been constitutional law, but lawyers who haven't sat down and read and considered the language of the Second Amendment. They've made assumptions about it, but haven't read and thought it out. And so just a principle of interpretation of language is, we want to consider authorial intent. And if the constructors of the Constitution were labeling a militia the people themselves and saying a militia means the people, then, man, we can't go saying, well, regulated militia means the army, right? And that's the biggest thing, is that it's just been one of the arguments that have been coming up, is they've tried to say that the militia is an army. And so then the only answer here is we just got to make sure that the army has guns, and that's what the Second Amendment is about. And I'm like, no, that can't be what it's about, and here's why. Because nobody describes a militia in that way, and it says that the people shall not be deprived the bearing of arms. So anyway, that's just been on my mind. Yeah.
The other thing that I noticed, I was telling a buddy of mine, actually on the last podcast I was recording for another podcast, that my wife and I, we started watching West Wing again on Netflix.
Yeah.
Which, great show, completely liberal. I don't agree with a thing that comes out of their mouths, but I love the characters. Like, the characters are really cool. And so, this one guy, his name is Toby. He's the head communication officer, or whatever they call him. And he's in a debate with someone about guns. And so, the guy he's debating goes, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And he goes, "Oh, you forgot the first part. A well-regulated militia being necessary to a free state." And he makes the comment, "Well, we don't know what they meant by that." And I'm like, that's the typical answer. Well, we don't know what they meant. And it's like, well, no, they didn't create this stuff in a vacuum. They expanded on it. They went deep on it. You got the Federalist Papers. You got the Anti-Federalist Papers. I mean, we know exactly what they meant when they were talking about the Second Amendment. And what they meant was literally the right of the people to keep and bear all arms of all kinds. If the government's got it, the people got it. They would have a fit at the NFA. They would never have allowed that. They'd be like, "Oh no, they get to have a rocket launcher. The people are having rocket launchers."
Exactly right.
And I mean, because they just got done not hunting deer, but fighting another tyrannical government.
Yeah, buddy.
And that's why they were saying, no, you're not going to infringe on the people. Yeah.
So, man, I'll just add to that this whole business of the militia being anything other than the free people with their arms. Tench Koch, which I'm probably saying his name right, it's wrong, Tenche, last name Coxe, in the Pennsylvania Gazette, February 20th, 1788. By the way, he was at the Constitutional Congress, was involved in drafting all the language. He says, "Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? It is feared then that we shall turn our arms each man against his own bosom. Congress have no power to disarm the militia. Their swords and every other terrible implement of the soldier are the birthright of an American. The ultimate power of the sword is not in the hands of either the federal or state governments, but where I trust in God, it will ever remain in the hands of the people." So even he is saying the militia are the people. It has nothing to do with any federal or even state organized body. The militia are the people. Now, I agree that there's a place for the state to have the opportunity for people to volunteer for the sake of defense of the state and whatever, but can't say it's a standing army. You're right on. Plenty of stuff, by the way. There's a site, m1911.com, that has some stuff about, it's mostly about pistols, but they've got some interesting quotes from founding fathers.
Somebody actually was smart enough to buy m1911.com?
Yeah, man. Well, no, it's Site M1911.
Oh, okay. I was like, man, they got M1911?
Oh, man, whoever would have done that. Somebody, I'm sure, has it somewhere, but it's probably not who we want it to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's been on my mind. I think I'm in a time in both in theology and in constitutional law that I'm frustrated that we don't go first to the source documents, and then secondly, we make assumptions about what they mean and interpret them through the lens of what we think now, rather than the lens of the writers. And so I'm like, it's not that hard for us to go and say, all right, what do they mean by militia? Well, here's all these quotes where clearly they're talking about the militia is the people. So anyway, that's just been on my mind. Hopefully that was helpful. If you want to even just search, Google search what the founding fathers meant by militia. Have a look at the Federalist Papers. Like, there's a lot of helpful stuff as we interpret the language of the Constitution, and it's not that hard. It just isn't. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful for some of our listeners as we're considering.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you hit on is one of the things that annoys me to no end as an American, and that is, okay, if we want to change things, then I may not be okay with changing it, but I would be okay if you did it the way that you're legally allowed to do it in our Constitution, which is not a redefinition of terms. It's not going, well, what we think they meant was this. No, we know what they meant. They said it. Now, some things needed to be changed. The first thing that comes to mind, black people being 3/5 of a person, bad, needed to be changed.
Yeah.
But to say, oh, well, no, that's not what they meant. What they meant was, and then come up with some stupid excuse as to, oh, this is really what is meant by this. I have a problem with that. Mm-hmm. It's like, if you believe it, then go ahead and get Congress to change it. Get the states to ratify an amendment if it needs to be, a constitutional change. But let's not redefine things based on our new paradigm today.
Yeah.
And that's where we as a people really need to be up in arms whenever we see the government do this in any area, not just ones that happen to be important to us. Like, obviously on this podcast, firearms are important to us. But in other areas, I think the whole idea of I find it morally repugnant that the government thinks that they can force me to spend my money on insurance and fine me if I don't. Yep. That's morally repugnant to me.
Yeah, it absolutely is wrong. That goes contrary to the Constitution, by the way. It's the whole idea. And then what it is they're fining us for not buying something. There's clear language we're not supposed to do that. So what do? They just called it a tax.
Yep.
Right? They put a different label on something to create a legal loophole when they are, in fact, breaking constitutional law. And this is what gets really tricky, where I'm like, we've got laws that are violations of the Constitution. Well, the Constitution is what makes us American. It's what allows us to sit back and say, okay, we've all agreed on the rules here. And so now we're voluntarily saying we're agreeing on this is what it's going to be like to be a part of this country. So when there are laws that violate the Constitution, well, now it's like, well, which thing do I obey? Well, I'm supposed to obey the Constitution. Now I've got this law. Now we're in contradiction. What do I do? And for the person who has really thought through things legally, it puts us in conundrums. And it should be something that everybody, but especially I think of law enforcement, when sit down and think, you took an oath to preserve the Constitution. Now you have to sit through. You can't just preserve the law. You have to think through what the Constitution says. And if the law is in violation of that, in order to keep your oath, you have to violate the law in favor of the Constitution. And we are not having these conversations enough where we think through logically and rationally what is actually the law of the land, what is actually the law that trumps another law. I just wish we were talking about this stuff more.
Yeah, I mean, a good example, I think, is people will always say, oh, well, the cops will never confiscate firearms. And now, especially with the completely unconstitutional red flag laws, where someone has not done anything wrong, they're taking firearms. And they're saying, oh, it's the greater good. Well, then arrest the guy. If you don't have enough to arrest the guy, then you definitely don't have enough to take away his constitutionally protected, natural, God-given rights.
Put aside guns from this discussion. We have the right to the assumption of innocence until proven guilty.
Yes.
The exact opposite is what's happening here. There's
exactly.
no due process, no anything. Like, put aside what anybody might think about guns. Like, that's a violation of all kinds of constitutional rights.
Well, and then you could even, like, you start expanding that and you start looking at everything else our government's doing. What about FISA courts? Oh, my gosh, dude. Are you kidding me? A secret court?
Yep.
Are you kidding? Like this?
Crazy,
how is this even constitutional? How has any judge anywhere looked at this and said, "Oh yeah, this is constitutional"? Of course it's not. Of course it's not. But like here in California, even really before the red flag laws, well, I mean, we've had them for a while here in California, but where we see it more is because California, you know, as I like to say, we're behind the enemy lines here. We are in communist California, and we cannot make 80% firearms without disclosing it to the state DOJ, getting a serial number from them, and putting that serial number on the gun by a gunsmith within, I think it's 10 days.
Man.
And so, excuse me. So if you did that, I mean, they've got all these rules and stuff, and one of the things that that you had to do, I believe, and I could be wrong on this, is you got to take a picture of it and send it in with your paperwork. And well, we've seen videos of this. Like these are home videos. We can see this actually happening. One guy took pictures of his 80% AR-15 lower that he had turned into an AR-15 pistol. And sent that in. Well, the cops came and confiscated it, took it away. And their rationale is, well, there's no AR-15 pistols on the California handgun roster, which is true. There's not. But that doesn't really mean anything because he made this gun himself, which he has the legal right to do, and therefore no handgun that is made from an 80% is on the handgun roster. So they're not coming and just collecting all of them. Like you buy that Polymer 80 that you can turn into essentially a Glock with a 1911 grip angle. No, they're not coming after those yet. You can bet they're going to.
They're going to find a way.
They're coming after this guy's AR-15 pistol as it's currently configured. Doesn't matter if he's got a really expensive sight on it or not. They're taking the whole thing and they're going, well, it's not on the roster. Well, of course it's not on the roster. It's an 80%er. So that's a totally made up excuse to confiscate someone's firearms, which is completely illegal, unconstitutional in every which way.
Yep.
And it's just this is the place that we're at, and that's why I look at what's happening in our nation and I'm scared. I'm scared for my kids.
Yeah, me too.
Because I don't know what it's going to mean. I mean, you know, as Reagan said, we're the last bastion of freedom, basically. I'm paraphrasing, and he's right. What's left after the United States? I mean,
nothing.
Yeah, I don't want to move to Canada. Are you kidding me? With socialism
up
there and no free speech and no firearm. I mean, I don't know.
Well, the conversation I'm trying to have with a lot of people is, okay, just look what they're doing. Due process removed. Put guns aside. This means that they could take your kids away, right? So if they're going to apply this to gun, they could decide that you think something or say something, and the state could come and take your kids, put them in an institution, which, by the way, is the place where they're going to be the most likely to be harmed. That's the rate of abuse there is much higher. But they can decide this guy's ideas are wrong. Just if in the same way that they could say, well, we don't like what this guy's saying on Facebook, we're going to red flag him. They could say the same thing and say, well, better take your kids away because they're not safe in that environment. We're not talking about a small leap. We're talking about them just starting to apply it a little wider. And this is why I tell people, even when something's going on that I disagree with, you know, somebody's saying something that's awful or whatever, and I say, listen, though, like, you can't ban that speech. And I disagree with it. In fact, I think it's abhorrent, but you can't ban that speech because if they can ban that, they can ban what I'm saying later on. And this is the conversation, especially when I'm talking to Republicans, where I'm like, hey, man, you know, pretty libertarian, call it conservative if you want, but
freedom loving.
Freedom loving. Well, you start talking about some of this stuff, and I'm like, hey, you're all on board to block this thing or that thing, and you're happy to enforce the Patriot Act or whatever you want to because it's advancing your agenda. You have to think about the fact that somebody else is going to have that power when the next guy gets in office. Sometimes I have to remind people that, hey, just because there's an R on the ticket in front of that person's name does not mean that they care about freedom and conservative values.
No. In fact, the very first book that I did in 2004 was called Modern Day Heroes. And my co-author and I, we reached out to all 50 governors, all 100 senators, all the congressional members, and basically asked them to give us stories from heroes from their states and their communities. And and so, you know, we got all these stories and we're sifting through them and putting the best ones in the book. And I remember looking up these politicians, and so many of them, I was like, okay, this guy's a total Democrat, but he's got an R after his name because he's in a area that he can't win as a Democrat. So he calls himself a Republican. And the same thing. Okay, this guy over here is a total Republican, but he's listed as a Democrat, and you look at where he lives in his county and all that, and I'm like, well, okay, that kind of makes sense because he isn't going to win if he says he's a Republican. It is about winning, not about what they truly believe, which is unfortunate. It's one of the reasons why I don't respect most politicians. You don't really know where they stand on most issues.
Yep.
It's unfortunate.
I'm with you, man.
Yeah.
So I have a review if you're interested.
Please.
Something that's related. And I want to be careful here because we're talking about red flag laws. We're talking about all kinds of other things. And if I'm not careful, this is going to sound like I'm advocating for something to fight that. I'm not necessarily doing that or not doing that. But one thing that I've noticed, we've been talking a lot about being prepared. We're talking about drawing and shooting from concealment. We talk about making sure you're ready. We talk about practicing and all that kind of stuff. And it hit me that not only am I not training enough, I need to train a lot more than I'm training, but it hit me that I don't have any type of tactical training. I shouldn't say not any type, but I have very little tactical training if there is a break-in in my house. Well, break-in in my house is actually one of the more common things that could happen where I would need to use my firearm. And so I've been looking around like, all right, so where do I learn about how to clear a room, how to handle an intruder in my house? Got my hands on the book, The Tactical Advantage by Gabriel Suarez. Have you heard of this book?
No, I haven't. I'm writing that down though.
Great book. So, I mean, I'm highly recommending it. Just did a little bit of research to find out, all right, what are people reading? And apparently this is the book that guys read when they're training for SWAT. Your operators are learning this. This is like kind of the definitive thing. I think it was written in the late 60s, early 70s, maybe a reissue in the 80s. I could be wrong about that. It's slightly dated, but the principles are right on point. And a lot of this, he's writing to both civilians and law enforcement and soldiers. And a lot of it is just like, all right, here's how you make sure your house is as planned for. If you have a break-in, how are you going to make sure that you're going around the corners right? How do you make sure you're clearing the house? You learn a little bit about levels of threat engagement. He's got pictures, he's got diagrams. It's really accessible, really simple. It's not overly technical. Really just a great thing for the toolbox. And so just reaching out to the From Concealment community saying like, start off reading this book. But also this is super interesting to me. It's just fun sounding. It's like, this will be good when I'm doing paintball later on, right?
Nice.
And so if anybody else has recommendations for tactical related books, shoot them into us because I would love to hear about it. I'm also interested in strategy. I just think it would just be fun to learn. Anytime I'm watching a movie where they've got the giant map and they're moving the like shuffleboards on the map, I'm like, I want to learn about this. This just looks so cool. And so any recommendations I'll take, but this is my new thing. Wanted to recommend Tactical Advantage and jump into that a little bit.
Yeah. This week I was able to do a tactical training on, I believe it was Monday.
Nice.
Yeah, it was Monday that I went. And man, what were we doing? I think last week we did low light. This week I think we did movement. And let me tell you guys, if you're like me, like because of where I live, I don't go out to outdoor ranges very often because it's too far for me. Well, I mean, it's not too far, but it's like an hour, right? So if it's an hour out there and an hour back, it's just I don't have the time for that during the day. So I go to indoor ranges, and certainly in Orange County, the best indoor range is FT3 Tactical, the cleanest, nicest. Great staff, very professional. I'm a member there, a paying member. I've been a member there for a number of years. I love going there, and I do as much training as I can there because it's really convenient for me. It's literally down the street, so I'm able to do it. Most of the handgun challenges I do are done at Evans, which is great because the staff lets Lance over there at Fast OC pretty much do whatever he needs to do for the challenges. We get to shoot steel poppers inside of an indoor range, which no one gets to do, right? But they let us do that over there. But it's not as nice of a range. I mean, it's not. It's smaller, and let's face it. I live in California. They don't really like ranges. They don't like guns. They don't like anything. So it's really hard to get a good one. But I go to as many trainings as I possibly can, and competitions. Competitions because, as we've talked about on the show, the adrenaline dump. So like last night, I did a competition at FT3, and very first stage we did is a drill where at 6 yards out, you've basically got an A-zone target. It's about a 6, maybe 8-inch circle on a piece of paper. You've got 10 seconds. You start with your firearm empty, slide forward, holstered, and you've got 3 magazines with 5 rounds each. And so you've got 10 seconds to see how many of those shots you can get off, and the only ones that count are the ones that are inside the circle. So, very first thing you do, the buzzer goes off, you got to load it, rack it, fire your 5 shots, dump the mag, put another mag in, rack it, do the 5 shots, and hopefully you still got time. And I don't literally think in that one, or at least last night, I don't think anyone got all 15 shots off in the 10 seconds, because you got to figure, I mean, it's 3 loads, basically. I mean, it's not started loaded. Yeah, and then, you're trying to handle the adrenaline and staying in the A zone. So like I did much better the first time, but the adrenaline was just coursing through me. It was a very first shot of the night for me. It was a second shooter up. And I mean, I think I did, in my opinion, I did horribly because I only got 9 shots in the circle. And I think I got like a total of 13 shots off. That means, 3 or 4 shots were outside of the circle. And I remember looking to a buddy of mine. It was his first time at the training or at the competition. I'm like, this is the reason why I do it, man. My body, I'm still shaking because of the adrenaline dump. It's timed. All this stuff is going on. But where else do you get to train like that? And, And, we did another drill. This is the one that I kept screwing up on. And it actually just became a big joke the whole night. It's they call it walk and draw. So we've got 3 targets set up, 25 yards, 15 yards, 7 yards, all of them with a non-threat target, and then your threat target. You get to start with a gun loaded, holstered, and then you've got to walk and shoot 4 shots in the threat, and then you have to holster. Always moving. Like you cannot stop. Like if you stop and shoot, it's a penalty. So it's always moving. That's why they call it walk and draw. And then you have to reholster the firearm, take your hand off the firearm while you're walking to the next one, shoot that one, and then then you go to the next one. But you're only allowed, I want to say, 2 10-round magazines. So you're going to have at least 1 mag change. And because you do have the extra rounds, you like if you screw up and hit 3 shots out of the A zone, you could take a couple extra shots. And I kept screwing up because I was not putting the gun back in the holster. So I had 2 penalties because I'm like, why would I put my gun back in the holster?
Yeah.
I got to keep going. But that wasn't the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise was just to get good at drawing and shooting on the move.
Yeah.
But I love stuff like that because of the adrenaline rush, and it's forcing you to do things that, unless you train for, how are you ever going to be ready should the time come? So clearing rooms, I haven't been able to do a training for that. Really around here, we'd have to go out to Front Sight in Nevada, and I've heard about some great courses that they got out there for clearing rooms and stuff like that. But I'd love to do it. Never done it though.
Yeah, I want to learn more. When nobody's home, I sometimes will dry fire practice, move around the house.
Oh, nice.
But that's very little of that. I actually want to do more of it. And the next phase for me too is learning about setting reflective objects around corners, so that if somebody's coming, you actually have the opportunity to look around the corner, and you're home. So all that's fun. It's for me, it's 90% just interesting, and 10% I want to be ready.
Sure.
The chances of something happening are low, but the chances of me having fun are high. Anyway, that's what's been on my mind, man. It's good stuff.
I dig it, man. I dig it. Well, hey, why don't you give them our final sponsor?
Yeah. Last thing, we always want to mention Lake Erie Arms, learms.net. We are coming into especially fun seasons. We do events all throughout the warm seasons. It is in Northeast Ohio, so we don't typically do stuff in February, but we have some really exciting stuff coming up, not the least of which is Glocktoberfest. Glocktoberfest is our all Glock event where we have everything you can imagine Glock related, and usually we've got a rep from Glock coming out. Great chance you eat for free, you shoot for free, you try pretty much every Glock we have available. Free shooting, everything. And then, if you're smart, you're going to pick out one of those guns and take it home. But anyway, that's what we got going on. Lake Erie Arms in Huron, Ohio, right near Cedar Point, which is like everybody's big roller coaster destination. So come ride some rides, shoot some guns, have a really good time. Check out learms.net.
Do you guys let people from behind enemy lines come shoot your Glock?
We sure do, man. Anytime, man.
Dude, I might have to come out for that, because that sounds like fun.
You really should. And you got a place to stay at the Sam's compound.
Woohoo!
And then, man, we've got my field out back, man. We can do all kinds of shooting out there.
See, that to me would be the weirdest thing in the world, being able to shoot on your own property, because
it's good times, man.
You can't do that here. I mean, if you're
super
shooting
good
here, it's because it has hit the fan and you're shooting your way out of here.
Yeah. Well, you got a place if you got to do that too. All right.
I love it. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back next week with another great episode.
All right. Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the From Concealment Podcast with Pete Mitchell and Dan Sams. Be sure to tune in next week for more gun talk. Also, check out the From Concealment website for more shooting-related goodness at FromConcealment.com.